Jamie McMahon and Christopher Kaufman were once considered quiet, likable young men by those who knew them well. Everyone thought they were just good guys. But out of the blue, they shocked their friends and family by unleashing a spree of kidnappings and murders that shook the small rural town of Gibson in Iowa. So, what led to such a drastic change in their behavior? Those who knew them say the answer lies in methamphetamines. Meth, a highly addictive stimulant that affects the central nervous system, became easily accessible in the population around 1997. Originally developed in the early 20th century from amphetamine, it was used in nasal decongestants and bronchial inhalers. This drug causes hyperactivity, non-stop talking, and a false sense of happiness and euphoria. In their crime spree, McMahon and Kaufman brutally murdered two women in what seemed like an execution-style killing. They also attempted to rob a bank, kidnapped two girls, and then vanished, leading the FBI on a lengthy manhunt across 6 states. This case has gone down in history as one of the most horrible in the United States. Jamie Gerald McMahon and Chris Michael Kaufman were born in small towns in Mahaska County, Iowa. McMahon's mother and Kaufman's father got together in 1979 and eventually married. The boys grew up together in Oskaloosa, Iowa, a city of then about 10,000 people. In 1997, Jamie was 22 and Chris was 18. McMahon was the outgoing, charismatic, and attractive older brother, while Kaufman was a quiet, non-athletic man. Kaufman had just graduated from high school with apparently few prospects and a group of friends who ran the streets, and McMahon had recently lost his job at a local plant. By the start of the summer, the 22-year-old McMahon was hanging out with 18-year-old Kaufman and his high school-age friends, and both were doing drugs. Friends and family described them as good kids who suddenly started to change. A few months before June 1997, Jamie began showing signs of personality changes. Soon after, he started spending a lot of time with his stepbrother Chris. This was surprising because, although they lived close by, they weren't part of the same social circle and hadn't been in close contact before. Suddenly, they were inseparable. It's unclear exactly when, but both began using methamphetamine, which their friends and family believe led them to commit horrific crimes. In the days leading up to their crime spree, the stepbrothers had been using meth and went almost a week without sleeping or eating. In fact, the night before the crimes, they partied with several girls at a hotel. That led up to Wednesday, June 11, 1997, when they embarked on a 4.5-hour-long rampage across south-central Iowa. Their first crime took place at a rural farm in What Cheer, Iowa, where 52-year-old Barbara Garber lived alone. Chris, apparently goaded by his brother, shot her directly in the forehead without hesitation or remorse. Barbara was then shot 3 more times at close range while seated in an armchair. She didn't resist, and there were no signs of forced entry. Afterward, Jamie and Chris fled in Garber's new vehicle, a dark green 1997 Dodge Dakota pickup truck, a model Jamie had always wanted but could never afford. Barbara was later found dead in her living room by her boss, who was concerned about her unusual absence from work. She was fully dressed, reclining on her left side as blood poured from her head wounds. Next to her feet lay her breakfast and a coffee cup. Neighbors were interviewed by investigators after Barbara's body was discovered. One neighbor reported seeing an unfamiliar blue car in Barbara's driveway early that morning as she left for work, but she didn't see anyone inside or take note of the license plate. The second murder and theft by the stepbrothers took place in rural Gibson. They went to the home of 18-year-old Eileen Schultz and shot her twice in the head at close range. This time, it was Jamie who pulled the trigger, ending the life of the young woman. Her mother had died in 1985 when Eileen was just 6 years old. Raised by her grandparents in the rural town of Gibson, Eileen had just graduated from high school a month before her murder. She worked part-time as a babysitter and a grocery store clerk. On the morning of the crime, witnesses saw Barbara Garber's green truck parked outside the Schultz home around 9:30 a.m. The stepbrothers took Eileen's car next, using it to commit their third crime, the robbery of Gibson Savings Bank, which happened around 10 a.m. There were no customers or security guards at the bank at that time, just a cashier and the manager. Two masked robbers dressed in ski masks, gloves, and work clothes stormed in. Pointing a gun at the manager's head, one of them went straight to the safe, stuffing all the cash into plastic trash bags. They left the bank with $65,000. The police and the FBI were alerted immediately, and the investigation kicked off without delay. Though the robbers wore masks, bank employees described them as white males. Unfortunately, the bank had no security cameras, making it harder for investigators to gather evidence beyond witness statements. An additional witness, a 10-year-old girl riding her bike on the street, saw two masked men carrying bags as they exited a gray car and entered the bank. She quickly rode away before the criminals left the scene. Investigators issued an alert for the car. About 2 miles from the bank in rural Gibson, behind some grain containers, the stepbrothers ditched Eileen's gray car and continued their escape in the pickup truck of their first victim. A police officer found the abandoned vehicle and soon identified it as belonging to Eileen Schultz. Heading to the Schultz home nearby, the officer found Eileen on the floor with a gunshot wound, dead. Beside her lay an audio cassette and 2.22 caliber bullets, the same type used in the murder of Barbara Garber. There were no signs of forced entry or defensive wounds. For the authorities, it was easy to link the three crimes that occurred in less than 2.5 hours and within 5 miles of each other, especially in a town where such incidents were extremely rare. Ballistic analysis later confirmed that both Barbara and Eileen were killed with the same weapon, a .22 caliber semi-automatic pistol. The massive attention from the media and the panic in the community drove the police and FBI to intensify their investigation. Officers received hundreds of calls with tips related to the case. One came from a young person who saw the green truck with 2 men on board in Oskaloosa. Another witness in Oskaloosa reported seeing a young man from the town between 10:30 and 11 a.m. on June 11th, driving a truck that had not been seen before. It was Jamie who was seen driving around in the blue car. There was another passenger, but the witness couldn't get a good look at them. By the end of that day, investigators had Jamie's name and a description of one of the suspects. The next day, they arrived at the last known address of Jamie McMahon, his parents' house in Oskaloosa. His parents mentioned they hadn't seen him since the day of the crime and shared that his stepbrother Chris, who had been inseparable from Jamie in recent weeks, was also missing. Jamie's friends told the police that they had seen the two stepbrothers together the night before the crimes, driving a blue car. This matched the vehicle that a neighbor had seen early in the morning outside Barbara Garber's house. A friend of Jamie's also revealed that on the day before the crimes, Jamie had come to his house with Christopher and had asked to borrow something unusual, a gun. He handed over a .22 caliber semi-automatic pistol. This information sparked a massive search for the stepbrothers and the green truck they were traveling in. The search spanned over 1,000 miles across 6 states, keeping Americans on edge and the community of Gibson terrified. Mandy, 17, and Amanda, 16, best friends from Oskaloosa, were reported missing by their parents the night before the brothers' crime spree. Unbeknownst to their families, Mandy and Amanda had been at the party Jamie and Chris threw at a hotel in Oskaloosa the night before the crimes. The next morning, June 11th, while the girls were still asleep, the young men carried out the murders and the bank robbery. After the crime spree, the stepbrothers picked up the girls from the hotel in the stolen green truck. They offered the girls a free trip to Florida, which the impressed teenagers accepted without asking many questions. At one point during their trip, they stopped at a river where the fugitives threw a bag into the water. Together, the 4 young people visited Branson, Missouri, and Walt Disney World. For the girls, it seemed like a fun vacation. After 7 days, Jamie and Chris confessed to the girls about the crimes they had committed. At the same time, Jamie reached out to his ex-girlfriend to find out what the police knew about him. Unbeknownst to him, one of the FBI's strategies was to place a device on the girl's phone to record and trace any calls from the fugitive. Although Jamie hung up quickly, the conversation lasted long enough for the FBI to trace the number. The police located him at a hotel in Florida, where staff confirmed that the young men had been there with the 2 teenagers, Mandy and Amanda. After their wild escapade, they had already left the scene. In an attempt to evade recognition, Chris even dyed his hair. 3 days later, in a drug-induced state, Jamie told Mandy and Amanda that he wouldn't mind killing them too. Terrified by this threat, the girls told them they wanted to go home. After some argument, Jamie reluctantly gave them money for a taxi and train fare back home. Once back in Oskaloosa, the girls went straight to the police and explained that as soon as they wanted to leave after finding out about the crimes, Jamie and Chris had held them captive. They were finally set free after 10 days. The girls claimed they had no idea where the stepbrothers were headed next. Soon after, there was a new discovery. An officer found in the A River the bag the stepbrothers had thrown away. Inside were the ski masks and work clothes Jamie McMahon and Chris Kaufman had worn during the bank robbery, as well as Island's wallet with her ID. The fugitive stepbrothers managed to evade a nationwide manhunt for about 3 weeks. There were sightings as far away as Texas and Minnesota. On June 30th, 1997, 19 days after the crimes, a man in Pensacola, Florida, called the police to report a 1997 green Dodge Dakota, the same vehicle the authorities were searching for. He said the driver looked just like Jamie McMahon. The caller even recognized the license plate while driving on Interstate 10. The case gained national attention after the vehicle and a description of the crimes were broadcast twice on America's Most Wanted, leading to their identification. Immediately, the county police started a thorough search for the vehicle. An officer found the truck at a motel. The stepbrothers had removed the front license plate in an attempt to confuse the authorities, but it was indeed the vehicle they were looking for. The police questioned the receptionist who, upon seeing their photos, confirmed that the 2 young men were staying there. However, she added that there was a 3rd man with them. Fearing that the fugitives might have taken a new hostage, officers evacuated the motel. A SWAT team along with negotiators arrived, snipers were positioned, and officers surrounded the area. A negotiator called the room's phone and the unidentified man answered. It quickly became clear he was not a hostage. He informed the officers that he had met the stepbrothers a few days ago while hitchhiking and had been partying with them. He explained that Jamie and Chris had been awake for 4 days, high on methamphetamines, and were now finally asleep. The man on the phone was shocked to learn that they were murderers and that they were armed. As the frightened man was unsure what to do, and the negotiator was trying to persuade him to leave the room, The stepbrothers woke up. Jamie grabbed the phone and the officer asked him to let the innocent man go. After 2 hours of tense negotiations, the man finally walked out of the room with his hands up. He had met the fugitives in New Orleans and spent a couple of days with them. He reported that the room was filled with lots of money and drugs, and as far as he could see, there was only one gun. The negotiator managed to speak with Chris over the phone, who was very tired and not in a clear state of mind to make decisions. Therefore, the negotiator turned back to Jamie and asked him to help his younger brother out of this situation. Jamie did just that, convincing Chris to leave the room with his hands raised. Only Jamie remained, exhausted, continuously handling the gun as if contemplating suicide and feeling utterly lost. He sought help over the phone from the negotiator. The officer convinced him to try to stay alive and surrender. Finally, he did. After 4 grueling hours, Jamie McMahon surrendered to the authorities, ending a lengthy chase that had taken him and his stepbrother across 6 states. The authorities searched the room, recovering $29,000 of the $65,000 stolen from the bank and the .22 caliber semi-automatic pistol. Empty beer bottles, marijuana, and methamphetamines rounded out the grim scene. Over 3 weeks, the stepbrothers had blown through $36,000 on drugs, hotels, and women. Back in Iowa, McMahon and Kaufman faced charges of first-degree murder and robbing a federal bank. They returned to a community that had been deeply concerned and frightened while awaiting their capture. Chris confessed to the crimes to the authorities, thinking that doing so might preempt his stepbrother from pinning both murders on him. Looking gaunt after weeks of heavy drug use, Kaufman gave a 95-minute interview where he insisted that the timing of the crimes hadn't been well planned and that they killed the women simply to eliminate potential witnesses. He claimed it was Jamie's idea to rob the bank and that they needed a car for the job. Jamie had already set his sights on Barbara Garber's truck, which he liked and wanted for their crimes. Barbara knew Jamie, which is why she let them into her house. As soon as she did, Chris pulled out the gun and ordered Barbara to sit down. Jamie repeatedly urged his brother to do it, and the young 18-year-old simply complied. Chris admitted to shooting 52-year-old Barbara Garber 4 times in the head. He claimed he did it to prevent her from reporting the theft of her truck. He described the brutal murders casually, as if discussing the weather, in a monotonous tone to an agent from Iowa's Criminal Investigation Division. "I just sat there for a while and then I did it," he explained. When asked how he felt about killing the 52-year-old grandmother, Chris admitted to feeling a bit guilty, but ultimately felt that all he had to do was pull the trigger. Since Jamie was particularly fond of Barbara's truck, they decided to steal a different car to rob the bank, then abandon it to continue their escape in the pickup. McMahon decided to visit another acquaintance island. She let them in after Jamie asked to borrow money supposedly for gas. She gave them $5, and as she turned around to put a cassette in the music player, Jamie shot her in the back of the head. To make sure she was dead, he shot her again between the eyes after she had fallen to the floor. Then they took the car keys and the wallet of Island and finally fled. Chris strongly denied having shot Island, and the authorities confirmed that it was Jamie who took the life of the 18-year-old, which he later admitted in court. When asked if he would do it all over again, Chris said he probably wouldn't do exactly the same thing. "I wouldn't kill anyone," he stated. The young man requested a psychiatric evaluation, asserting that he knew he could be capable of killing someone in prison if they tried to bother him. The stepbrothers were each sentenced to 5 life terms after pleading guilty to first-degree murder, car theft, and armed bank robbery. They agreed to plead guilty on the condition that federal prosecutors would not seek the death penalty. The father of the stepbrothers insisted that both Jamie and Chris were good kids at heart. "If they did this, we feel drugs were the cause. That's the only thing that could have been," he said. Methamphetamine use was on the rise in the region around that time. In 1997, Iowa was identified as one of the top 5 states in the U.S. where the use of methamphetamine. Known as the poor man's cocaine, it began to gain followers in the working-class areas of southeast Iowa due to its ease of manufacture and relative affordability. Health experts note that methamphetamine use can lead to paranoid behavior, weight loss, bad temper, and irritability. 20 years after the crimes, at 42 years old and having spent nearly half his life behind bars, Jamie McMahon decided to end his life. In November 2017, he was found unconscious in his cell. Authorities determined it was an apparent suicide. Despite immediate life-saving attempts by the medical staff, Jamie was declared dead at 10:30 a.m. Jamie and Chris's story is a stark reminder of how drugs can lead to disastrous and irreversible decisions. These guys wanted to endlessly extend their ecstasy from drugs, alcohol, parties, and women. To fund their lifestyle, they made the most insane decision to rob a bank. But then they needed a getaway car. And in that chain of poor choices, they murdered 2 women without any mercy to accomplish what they wanted. And that wraps up today's episode of Unreal True Crime. Don't forget to subscribe and hit like if you appreciate my work. Until next time.